Welcome to Adu Globe. Discover new ideas, learn exciting things, and be amazed every day. The eyes of the world were fixed on Alaska, where US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin sat face to face at the same table. This was not just an ordinary meeting. It was a moment that captured the attention of global media, politicians, and analysts alike. The big question is, what really happened during those 3 hours of closed-door talks? Was there any serious step taken toward ending the war in Ukraine, or was it more of a diplomatic show designed for the cameras? Across the world, reactions are divided. Some believe it could be a major step toward peace, while others argue it was nothing more than a display of power. In this video, we'll explore exactly what was discussed at this historic meeting, and whether or not any real sign of a ceasefire actually emerged. To truly understand why this meeting in Alaska became such a global headline, we need to look at the wider context that made it so important. For more than 3 years, the war in Ukraine has reshaped international relations, disrupted economies, and tested the limits of global diplomacy. The conflict began when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, sparking one of the largest security crises in Europe since World War II. The fighting has led to tens of thousands of casualties, millions of people displaced from their homes, and an ongoing humanitarian crisis that has shaken the entire region. In response, the United States, alongside European allies, imposed some of the harshest economic sanctions ever seen in modern history against Russia. These sanctions targeted Russian banks, energy exports, military supplies, and even individual oligarchs close to the Kremlin. The goal was to put pressure on Moscow to end its military campaign, but instead, the war dragged on, creating a stalemate that left both Ukraine and Russia paying an enormous cost. For many countries, especially in Europe, the conflict also created economic shocks, with rising energy prices, food supply challenges, and broader uncertainty across global markets. Amid this backdrop, Donald Trump's return to the White House added another dramatic layer. After leaving office in 2021 and making a political comeback in the 2024 US election, Trump positioned himself as someone who could make a deal and potentially end the war more quickly than traditional diplomatic channels had managed. His style of direct negotiations, personal diplomacy, and bold statements always generate headlines, and his approach to Russia has long been a subject of debate in American politics. Supporters believe that his willingness to speak directly with adversaries could open doors for peace, while critics argue that it risks undermining long-standing alliances, particularly with NATO and European partners. For Vladimir Putin, this summit was equally significant. Isolated internationally because of the war, facing ongoing sanctions, and struggling with the costs of a long conflict, the chance to sit across the table from the President of the United States was a rare opportunity. It was more than just about Ukraine. It was about legitimacy. Appearing on equal footing with Washington allowed Moscow to project strength back home and to signal to the rest of the world that Russia still had a seat at the table in major global discussions. This combination of factors, a grinding war in Ukraine, Western sanctions squeezing Russia, Europe watching nervously, and Trump stepping back onto the world stage, is what made the Alaska meeting so important. It wasn't just a diplomatic encounter between two powerful leaders, it was a symbolic moment that carried the weight of thousands of lives affected by war, the tension between rival powers, and the hope, however faint, that dialogue might pave the way for something different. Whether it was realistic to expect an immediate ceasefire or not, the world couldn't help but watch closely. The stakes were simply too high, and the questions too urgent to ignore. When the meeting finally began in Anchorage, Alaska, the atmosphere was filled with symbolism and global anticipation. Cameras captured the moment as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin shook hands in front of their national flags, a gesture that many described as both formal and tense. For nearly 3 hours, the two leaders spoke behind closed doors, while the world waited to hear what would emerge from their conversation. Trump, known for his straightforward and sometimes dramatic style, described the talks as very productive. His words were short, confident, and designed to give the impression that progress had been made. The choice of phrase immediately caught the attention of international media. Analysts debated what productive actually meant in this context, since no concrete details were shared. Was it a signal of hope, or simply diplomatic language meant to keep doors open? On the other side, Vladimir Putin appeared calm and deliberate in his remarks. He suggested that Russia and the United States were close to an understanding. This statement sounded optimistic, but it left many questions unanswered. What kind of understanding was he referring to? Did it involve Ukraine directly, or was it more about future negotiations? Putin's tone gave the impression that Russia wanted to show flexibility, yet without making any clear commitments. Despite these carefully chosen words, the reality that followed was less dramatic. No formal agreement, no ceasefire, and no joint statement on ending the war were announced. Instead, both leaders spoke in general terms, leaving room for speculation. For observers, this created a contrast between the grand images of red carpets, military salutes, and press cameras, and the absence of any tangible results. In the end, the dramatic highlights of the summit were not about breakthrough deals, but about the spectacle itself, the symbolism of two powerful leaders facing each other at a critical moment in history. The handshake, the powerful words like productive and understanding, and the carefully managed press moments were enough to dominate global headlines. But behind the scenes, the essential question, how and when the war in Ukraine might actually move toward peace, remained unanswered. This left many people wondering whether the summit was a real step toward solutions or simply a performance for the world to watch. When all the excitement and media coverage around the Alaska meeting settled, the reality of what had been decided became clear. Despite the dramatic buildup and the long closed-door talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, there was no official announcement of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Both leaders gave optimistic remarks, but neither side presented a concrete plan or written agreement that could stop the war immediately. One key reason for this was the absence of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Since Ukraine is directly involved in the conflict, no final decision on peace or ceasefire could be made without his participation. This meant that while Trump and Putin could discuss broad ideas, they were not in a position to finalize anything binding. Diplomatically, this left the talks more as an exchange of views than as a real negotiation. Trump, speaking after the summit, said the discussions were very productive, but he also added that the next step is in the hands of President Zelensky. With this statement, Trump made it clear that the United States and Russia alone cannot bring the war to an end. Ukraine must also agree to any terms for peace. This line shifted global attention back to Kyiv, highlighting that the ultimate decision rests with Ukraine's leadership. For many observers, this outcome was not surprising. Analysts had already noted that without Ukraine's involvement, it would be almost impossible to achieve a breakthrough. Still, the meeting held symbolic importance. It showed that communication between Washington and Moscow was still possible, even in the middle of a conflict. In simple terms, what actually happened was that both leaders created headlines but no concrete results. The war continues, the sanctions remain in place, and the humanitarian situation has not changed. Yet, the Alaska Summit opened the possibility of future talks that might include Ukraine more directly. The world is still waiting, and the real question now is whether Zelensky will join the process, and under what conditions. The Alaska meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin quickly became the top headline across international media. In the United States, television networks and major newspapers covered every detail, but the reactions were mixed. Supporters of Trump described the talks as an example of strong diplomacy, highlighting his statement that the next step is in the hands of President Zelensky. Critics, however, argued that without concrete results, the meeting was more symbolic than practical. American analysts generally agreed that the summit showed dialogue was still possible, but the lack of agreements meant the conflict would continue unchanged. In Europe, the reaction was cautious. Leaders of the European Union stressed that any real progress on peace could only be achieved if Ukraine itself was directly involved in the talks. European media highlighted the absence of Ukraine's president as the main reason no breakthrough occurred. For many European observers, the Alaska Summit was a reminder of how complex the situation remains, and how difficult it is to balance diplomacy with the realities on the ground. From Ukraine, the reaction was firm but measured. Officials in Kyiv made it clear that decisions about the country's future could not be made without Ukraine at the table. Ukrainian media emphasized that while dialogue between Washington and Moscow was important, the ultimate choice rests with Kyiv. Many Ukrainians expressed concern that such high-profile meetings risked overshadowing the real suffering caused by the ongoing war. Neutral countries, including some in Asia and the Middle East, focused more on the symbolic value of the meeting. Their media coverage framed the summit as a sign that channels of communication remain open, which could, in the long term, reduce risks of escalation. At the same time, they acknowledged that no immediate results came out of the talks. Overall, the global reaction to the Alaska Summit can be summarized in one line: the world was watching closely, but the outcome left more questions than answers. For some, it was a step forward in keeping diplomacy alive. For others, it was simply a reminder that peace remains a distant goal. After the Alaska Summit, the question on everyone's mind is, what comes next? While the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin created headlines worldwide, the reality is that no final decision was made. The conflict in Ukraine remains ongoing, and the humanitarian situation is still critical. Sanctions from the West are still in place, and there is no official agreement for a ceasefire. What the summit did achieve was to keep the doors of dialogue open. International politics often moves slowly, and even a single meeting can have long-term symbolic value. By sitting at the same table, the United States and Russia showed that, despite deep tensions, both sides are still willing to communicate. This is important, because without communication, peace becomes impossible. For Ukraine, the next step is especially important. As Donald Trump himself pointed out, the future of any negotiation depends on President Volodymyr Zelensky's direct involvement. Without Ukraine's leadership, there can be no meaningful or lasting solution. This is why global attention is now shifting toward Kyiv. World leaders are waiting to see how Ukraine responds, and whether Zelensky will be ready to join such talks under the right conditions. From a broader perspective, the Alaska meeting also reminded the world that peace is a complex process. There are no quick fixes, and major international conflicts cannot be solved in a single discussion. At the same time, the fact that Trump and Putin were able to sit down and talk openly was, in itself, seen as a small but significant step toward reducing tensions. In simple words, nothing has been solved yet, but the process has begun. The world is still watching closely, and the next moves by Ukraine, the US, and Russia will decide whether this summit was just symbolic, or the beginning of a longer path to peace. In the end, the Alaska Summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin did not deliver a breakthrough, but it did remind the world that dialogue is still possible. Real peace will take time, effort, and the direct involvement of Ukraine's leadership. For now, the situation remains open, and the next steps are uncertain. But one thing is clear: the world is watching closely, and every move matters. What do you think? Was this meeting just symbolic, or the beginning of a longer journey toward peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video informative, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more updates and in-depth analysis. Your support means a lot and helps bring you the latest verified global news in a simple and clear way.